The morning sun, a brilliant and mocking gold, streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse suite, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like celebratory confetti. On any other day, the view of the city skyline would have filled Alex with a sense of boundless possibility. Today it felt like a gilded cage. The scent of fresh lilies, Chloe's favorite, was cloying and thick, a fragrant lie permeating the very air he breathed. His tuxedo, tailored and perfect, hung from the closet door, a costume for a role he now knew was a sham. The silence of the suite was a physical weight, broken only by the frantic hummingbird beat of his own heart. It was an accident, a simple request for the time that had led him to the precipice. Chloe's phone, left charging on the marble bathroom counter, had buzzed with an incoming message just as he passed. A flicker of a name, Mark, had caught his eye, a familiar name that should have meant nothing. But something in the casual early-hour timing of it, a thread of intuition, had made his hand dart out and lift the device. The lock screen gave way to his own smiling face, the photo she'd set for him. A final cruel irony before the world shattered. The texts were not hidden, not buried in some secret folder. They were brazen, sitting right there in her messages, a chronicle of betrayal written in cold, digital ink. His best man, his brother in all but blood. Mark's words were graphic, possessive, laced with an intimacy that stole the air from Alex's lungs. Chloe's replies were worse, playful, passionate, full of plans and whispered secrets that painted a vivid picture of hotel rooms and stolen afternoons. The dates stretched back months, a parallel life running concurrently with his own, a shadow marriage built on his trust. A cold, sharp clarity cut through the initial blinding wave of nausea. The pain was a living thing, coiling in his gut, threatening to double him over. He saw their faces, Chloe's radiant smile as she'd said yes, Mark's firm handshake and unwavering gaze when he'd asked him to be his best man. Every memory was now tainted, every laugh, every promise revealed as a carefully constructed performance. He gripped the edge of the sink, his knuckles white, staring at his own reflection in the mirror. The man who stared back was a stranger, his eyes hollowed out, the joy of the day draining from them to be replaced by something hard and glacial. He could cancel. A single phone call. He could unleash the chaos now, scream the truth into the quiet morning and watch the carefully arranged dominoes of their lives fall into ruin. But as the initial shock receded, a new, more potent emotion began to take root. It wasn't just hurt. It was a deep, simmering fury, a desire for something more than a private, messy confrontation. They had stolen his past and his present. He would seize control of the future. A plan, cold and meticulous, began to form in the wreckage of his heart. They wanted a wedding. They would get one. But it would be a wedding they would never forget. A spectacle of their own making turned back upon them. He would not run. He would not hide his pain. He would wear it as armor, and he would walk down that aisle not as a groom, but as an architect of their public ruin. He would give them the perfect day, right up until the moment he tore it all down in front of everyone they knew. The mask settled over his features, smoothing the anguish into a placid, determined calm. The show, he decided, must go on. The art of deception required a surgeon's precision and an actor's grace, and Alex moved through the pre-wedding rituals with a chilling, polished calm. The grand hotel ballroom, transformed into a sea of white roses and shimmering chiffon, hummed with the excited chatter of 200 guests. Each smiling face, each warm handshake, was a thread in the elaborate tapestry of the lie he was weaving. He felt like a ghost at his own feast, observing the celebrations from behind a pane of one-way glass, his true self screaming in silence while his reflection smiled and nodded. He found Chloe surrounded by her bridesmaids, a vision in a silken robe, her laughter like wind chimes. She kissed his cheek, her touch sending a jolt of ice through his veins. He wrapped an arm around her, his grip firm and possessive, a performance for the watching crowd. He murmured something about her looking beautiful, the words tasting like ash, and saw the genuine delight in her eyes. It was the final confirmation of her duplicity, the ease with which she inhabited her role. He excused himself, the mask of the eager groom perfectly in place, and moved deeper into the throng. His first stop was the audio-visual control booth, a small, dark room tucked behind the main dais. The technician, a young man with headphones and a distracted air, was running final checks. Alex leaned in, his voice a model of friendly concern, asking if the microphones were flawless, if the video playback was cued and ready. He needed everything to be perfect for his speech, he explained. A nervous groom wanting his vows to be heard by all. The technician assured him the system was state-of-the-art. Alex's fingers, hidden from view, brushed against a USB drive in his pocket. With a deft, casual movement, he plugged it into the main console, a sleight of hand disguised as an inquisitive point towards a blinking light. The digital poison was now in the vein of the celebration. Next, he sought out Mark. He found his best man near the bar, already holding a whiskey, his posture radiating a relaxed confidence that made Alex's jaw tighten. He clapped Mark on the back, a gesture that had once signified brotherhood and now felt like marking a target. They spoke of inconsequential things, the weather, the quality of the scotch, a remembered joke from their college days. Alex watched the man's face, searching for a flicker of guilt, a shadow of the betrayal that had shattered his world. There was nothing, only the easy camaraderie of a lifelong friend. The coldness inside Alex intensified, solidifying his resolve. He slipped a small, folded square of paper, a printed hotel receipt from one of their afternoons, into the inner pocket of Mark's discarded jacket, a piece of evidence planted for its eventual dramatic discovery. He circulated through the room, a study in controlled motion. He laughed at his uncle's tired jokes. He hugged his weeping mother. He assured his father that he wasn't nervous at all. Every interaction was a calculated move on a chessboard only he could see. His eyes, however, were constantly scanning, assessing. He noted the positions of the large projection screens, the range of the speakers, the sightlines from every table. He was not a man preparing to be married. He was a director staging his masterpiece of ruin. The cheerful facade was a fortress, and behind its walls a cold, determined engine hummed, counting down the minutes until the mask would fall, and the world would see the raw, unforgiving truth he held in his hands. The air in the ceremony hall was thick with the scent of gardenias and the soft, reverent hush of 200 held breaths. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting fragmented rainbows over the assembled guests. A congregation of smiling, expectant faces turned towards the flower-strewn archway where Alex stood. He was a statue of calm, his hands clasped before him, his gaze fixed on the ornate double doors at the far end of the aisle. The string quartet's melody swelled, a soaring, romantic piece that should have been the soundtrack to the happiest moment of his life. Instead, it felt like a funeral dirge, each note a hammer blow against the vault containing his rage. The doors swung open. A collective soft sigh rippled through the crowd as Chloe appeared, a vision in ivory silk and lace, her face veiled, her arm linked with her father's. She was every inch the blushing bride, a picture of pure, untarnished joy. Alex watched her slow, measured progress down the petal-strewn runner, his heart a cold, hard stone in his chest. He saw the guests dab at their eyes, heard the whispered compliments on her beauty. They saw a fairy tale. He saw the final perfect prop in his play of retribution. She reached his side, her eyes shining up at him through the delicate veil. Her smile was tremulous, genuine in its ignorant happiness. The officiant, a benign-faced man with a gentle voice, began the traditional opening, words about love and commitment that now sounded like a poorly written farce. Alex's attention was not on the man, but on the two people flanking him. He felt, rather than saw, the nervous energy emanating from Mark, who stood a few feet to his right. He could almost hear the frantic rhythm of his best man's pulse. Then it was his turn, the moment the entire agonizing morning had been building towards. He turned fully to face Chloe, taking her hands in his. Her fingers were warm and trusting in his cold grip. He looked directly into her eyes, and for a fleeting second, he saw the ghost of the woman he had loved. the one he had believed was real. The sight fueled him, sharpening the edges of the words he was about to deliver. His voice, when it came, was clear and steady, carrying to the very back of the hall, amplified by the microphones he had so carefully tested. He began with the expected platitudes, speaking of beauty and light, but his gaze was unwavering, intense. Then, the tone shifted, almost imperceptibly at first. The words began to twist. He spoke of trust, describing it not as a gentle gift but as a fortress, built brick by brick over years, a structure that could house one's entire world. He talked about the sanctity of that space, the vulnerability of allowing someone past its walls. His eyes remained locked on Chloe's, and he saw the first flicker of confusion in their depths. He mentioned promises, not the sweet nothings of lovers, but the solemn, unspoken vows between friends, the bonds that were supposed to be unbreakable. He felt Mark shift his weight behind him. He continued, his voice dropping to a more intimate yet still perfectly audible register. He spoke of betrayal, not as a sudden storm, but as a slow, insidious poison, a crack in the foundation that could bring the entire fortress crashing down. He described the unique agony of a wound delivered by the hands you trusted most, a pain that was both private and profound. He watched as Chloe's smile faltered, her grip on his hands tightening slightly. A delicate flush crept up her neck. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Mark's hand rise to adjust his tie, a jerky, unnatural movement. The crowd, initially rapt, began to stir. The words were just ambiguous enough, just poetic enough to be passed off as deep romantic sentiment. But the undercurrent was unmistakable, a current of ice and accusation. The festive atmosphere curdled into one of tense, bewildered anticipation. Guests exchanged glances, their brows furrowed. The air, once light with celebration, grew heavy, charged with a dawning, collective unease. They were no longer witnessing a simple exchange of vows. They were spectators at the edge of a precipice, watching a man balance between love and something far darker. His every word a stone dropped into the still waters of the day, sending out ripples of private shame into the most public of arenas. The final double-edged syllable of his vow hung in the air, a venomous echo in the stunned silence. The officiant, his benign smile now strained at the edges, cleared his throat and prepared to continue the scripted ritual. He turned slightly towards Chloe, his mouth opening to invite her to speak her own promises into the charged atmosphere Alex had created. But the ceremony was no longer his to command. A single sharp movement cut through the tension. Alex's hand shot up, a clean, decisive gesture that halted the officiant's words before they could form. Every eye in the hall was riveted on him. The confusion on Chloe's face had solidified into naked alarm, her knuckles white where she gripped her bouquet. Mark had taken a half-step forward, his body coiled as if to intervene, but frozen by the sheer, audacious rupture of protocol. Alex's expression was one of cold, detached purpose. He did not look at his bride, nor at his best man. His gaze was fixed on the small, discreet audio-visual control booth at the side of the hall. He gave a single, slow nod. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The silence was absolute, a vacuum waiting to be filled. Then, the gentle string quartet music, which had been humming softly in the background, cut out abruptly. The sudden void of sound was more jarring than any noise. A collective, sharp intake of breath swept through the guests, and then their voices filled the hall. It was Chloe's voice first, breathy and intimate, laced with a familiar laughter that Alex had once lived for. I can't stop thinking about last Thursday, the way he just drones on about his work. It's such a relief to be with someone who actually sees me. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Heads swiveled, looking from Alex's stony face to Chloe's, which had drained of all color, leaving her makeup a garish mask. Before anyone could process it, Mark's voice answered, smooth and confident, emanating from every speaker. He's a fool, Chloe, a dedicated, loyal fool. He's building a life for you, and we're just living it. Gasps erupted, sharp and percussive, punctuating the recorded conversation. The words private and profane painted a vivid, ugly picture in the sanctified space. They spoke of specific dates that coincided with Alex's business trips, of inside jokes that were cruel parodies of his own, of a shared contempt for the very trust he had just eulogized in his vows. The audio was crystal clear, every sigh and whispered endearment a weapon honed to a razor's edge. Chloe made a small, choked sound, her hands flying to her mouth. Her veil seemed to mock her now, a flimsy shield against the onslaught of her own treachery. Mark stood rigid, his face a sickly shade of gray, his eyes wide with a horror that was both personal and profoundly public. He looked towards the exits, but there was no escape. The truth had them surrounded, broadcast from every corner of the room. The recording played on, a relentless, humiliating exposé. It detailed plans for a future that explicitly excluded the man standing at the altar, their laughter a cruel counterpoint to the shattered dreams of the guests listening. Whispers turned into exclamations of disgust. A woman near the front stood up, her hand over her heart. Another guest pointed a shaking finger at Mark, his expression one of betrayed fury. Alex stood immobile at the epicenter of the chaos he had engineered. He watched the dominoes fall, saw the shock and outrage transform the faces of his family and friends. He saw his mother's hand clutch at his father's arm, saw the dawning comprehension and anger in the eyes of his colleagues. This was the justice he had craved, a surgical, public stripping away of every lie, every pretense. The perfect wedding was now a courtroom, and the verdict was written in the ashen faces of the accused and the roaring condemnation of the jury they had once called their guests. The fortress of their deception lay in ruins, and he, the architect of its destruction, watched the dust settle with a heart that felt nothing at all. The reception hall was a masterpiece of suspended disbelief. Crystal chandeliers cast a soft, forgiving light over round tables draped in ivory linen, each centerpiece a riot of white hydrangeas and roses that could not quite mask the lingering scent of scandal. The air, once thick with gardenias and joy, now hummed with a low, nervous energy, a collective tremor that ran through the assembled guests like a subterranean shockwave. They had moved from the ceremony hall in a dazed procession, a flock of sheep herded from one trauma to the next, their festive clothes and forced smiles a stark contrast to the pallor of shock that still clung to them. They sipped champagne that tasted of metal and anticipation, their conversations hushed, their eyes darting towards the top table where the central players in the drama were seated in a tableau of excruciating tension. Alex stood, the gentle chime of his knife against the crystal flute cutting through the murmur like a scalpel. Every head turned. He was the picture of calm, his tuxedo still impeccable, his posture relaxed. He offered a small, wistful smile, the ghost of the man they all thought they knew. He began as any groom would, his voice warm and resonant, thanking them for sharing this day. He spoke of family, of old friends, of the journey that had led him here. He looked at Chloe, who sat rigid in her chair, her magnificent gown seeming to swallow her whole. He called her beautiful, his tone laced with a tenderness that was both convincing and utterly chilling. He raised his glass slightly towards Mark, acknowledging his best man, his brother, his voice thick with a feigned, nostalgic affection. For a few suspended moments, he wove the illusion back together, offering a lifeline of normalcy that his guests desperately grabbed onto. A few hesitant smiles returned. Perhaps they dared to hope the ceremony had been a bizarre, terrible mistake. A groom's nervous breakdown, now past. Then the shift. It was not a shout or a dramatic pause, but a subtle cooling of his tone, a hardening around the eyes. The nostalgic warmth evaporated, replaced by a forensic clarity. "They say you truly know someone when you see their messages," he said, his voice dropping into a more intimate yet perfectly projected register. The sentence hung in the air, innocuous, yet loaded. Before the unease could fully register, the large projection screens flanking the dance floor, which had been displaying a slideshow of happy couple photos, flickered and changed. The first image was a text thread. Chloe's name was at the top. The words were unmistakable, a graphic description of a rendezvous that had taken place on the weekend of his grandmother's funeral. A fresh wave of gasps erupted. Chloe let out a small, strangled cry, her hands flying to cover her face, but it was too late. The evidence was 30 feet tall. Alex continued his speech, his voice now a calm, relentless narration to the visual carnage. He spoke over the images, detailing the timeline of the affair with the detached precision of a prosecutor. Hotel receipts appeared on screen, their dates circled in red. Security camera stills, grainy but identifiable, showed Mark and Chloe entering a discreet downtown hotel, his arm around her waist. Then came the photos they had taken themselves, a selfie in a mirror laughing. From a weekend he had believed she was on a spa trip with friends. Each new piece of evidence was a fresh detonation in the room. The guests' reactions crystallized from shock into pure, unadulterated outrage. Loyalties, once firm, shattered and realigned in an instant. Family members who had hugged Mark an hour earlier now glared at him with naked contempt. A table of Chloe's friends who had gushed over her dress now looked at her with expressions of horrified betrayal. The low hum became a roar of condemnation. A glass tipped over, shattering on the floor, the sound lost in the tumult. Chloe finally broke. The composure she had fought to maintain since the ceremony dissolved into raw, shuddering sobs that racked her entire body. She slumped forward, her face buried in her arms on the table, the pristine white silk of her sleeve soaking up her tears. She was a monument to her own ruin, exposed and utterly alone in a room full of people. Alex stood above it all, his glass still raised. He was no longer toasting to love or a future. He was toasting to the truth, a bitter, brutal vintage that he had forced everyone to drink. He watched the chaos, the shifting allegiances, the destruction of two reputations, and felt the cold, quiet satisfaction of a plan perfectly, devastatingly, executed. The toast was not an end, but a declaration of war, in a battle only he had known was being fought. The roar of the crowd was a living entity, a beast of outrage and schadenfreude that fed on the spectacle of ruin. Chloe's sobs were a counterpoint to the angry buzz, a raw, human sound lost in the cacophony of judgment. Mark was on his feet, his chair screeching backward, his face a contorted mask of panic and fury. He pointed a trembling finger at Alex, his mouth working, but his words were swallowed by the din. It was a pantomime of denial, a desperate, flailing attempt to grasp control of a narrative that had already been written in indelible ink on the giant screens. Alex waited, a statue of patience amidst the storm. He let the chaos build, let the accusations fly between guests, let the reality of the evidence sink its claws deep into everyone present. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he raised a hand. It was not a plea for quiet, but a command. The room, conditioned by the sheer force of his earlier revelations, began to hush, the noise receding like a tide, leaving behind a beach littered with the wreckage of friendships and family ties. Mark found his voice first, the words bursting from him high-pitched and strained. He called it a lie, a sick digital fabrication, the rantings of a jealous man terrified of commitment. He appealed to the crowd, to their years of knowing him, his gestures wide and frantic. Chloe, lifting her tear-streaked face, echoed the denial in a broken whisper, her voice cracking as she called Alex's name, a plea for the man she remembered to re-emerge from this cold, calculating stranger. Alex's response was not verbal. He simply picked up a small leather-bound portfolio from beside his plate. The click of the brass clasp was unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He withdrew a single sheet of paper, holding it up for a moment as if examining it himself, then nodded once more to the technician in the booth. A new image bloomed on the screens, magnifying the document for all to see. It was a credit card statement marks with a specific charge highlighted in glaring yellow. The vendor was the Grand Imperial Hotel. The date was a Thursday in October, a day Alex had been presenting at a conference in another state. The amount was for a single, luxurious room. A fresh wave of murmurs, this time darker, more certain, swept through the hall. The digital evidence of texts and photos could, in some desperate corner of the mind, be dismissed as forgery. But this was a tangible financial footprint, a piece of the real world that corroborated the entire sordid story. Mark's denials withered in his throat, his confidence deflating like a pierced balloon. He stared at the screen, his shoulders slumping, the fight draining out of him. The confrontation then splintered, exploding outward from the top table into the heart of the guests. A burly uncle of Alex's stood and jabbed a finger at Mark, his voice a guttural roar of betrayal. One of Chloe's bridesmaids, her face pale, turned on her, hissing accusations of their own friendship being a lie. The wedding dissolved into a dozen smaller, furious arguments, a civil war erupting in formal wear. Long-held grudges and secret alliances surfaced in the toxic atmosphere. Friends turning on friends, families dividing along fault lines that had been invisible moments before. Through the escalating bedlam, Alex's parents made their way to his side. His mother's eyes were red-rimmed, her hand clutching his arm not in support, but in a grip of profound distress. His father's face was etched with a deep, troubled frown. They had watched their son meticulously and publicly destroy two people, and the cold precision of it frightened them more than any hot-headed rage ever could. His mother whispered his name, her voice trembling, asking him what he had done, what this cruel spectacle was meant to achieve. His father questioned the method, the lack of mercy, the permanent nuclear fallout he had chosen over a private reckoning. Their words were not of condemnation, but of a deep, unsettling fear for the soul of the son they thought they knew. They stood before him not as allies, but as the first witnesses to the moral ambiguity of his victory, their presence a silent accusation that his justice had cost him a piece of his own humanity. Alex met their gaze, his own eyes offering no apology, only the unyielding hardness of a man who believed the end, no matter how devastating, justified the means. The confrontation had ended not with a bang, but with the slow, sickening crumble of a landslide. The initial fury had burned itself out, leaving behind the cold, gray ash of reality. The reception hall, once a temple to celebration, now resembled a field hospital after a battle. Clusters of people stood frozen in islands of shared shock, while others moved with a frantic, purposeless energy, desperate to escape the toxic atmosphere. The air was thick with the scent of ruined food, spilled wine, and the acrid tang of humiliation. Alex remained at the epicenter, a solitary rock in the receding tide of chaos. He did not move to console, to explain, or to flee. He simply observed, his gaze a cool, analytical lens sweeping over the wreckage of his own design. He watched as the intricate web of his social life tore itself apart in real time. A lifelong friend of Mark's, his face a mask of disgust, turned his back on the best man, physically shoving him away as Mark tried to approach, his attempts at explanation now reduced to pathetic, slurred mutterings. The action was a signal, a permission slip for others to choose sides. And choose they did. The division was swift and brutal, a great schism running through the heart of the guest list. Chloe's family formed a protective, weeping huddle around her, their bodies a human shield against the glares and whispered condemnations. Their loyalty was a furious, blind thing, directed not at the truth but at the source of their public shame, Alex. He saw Chloe's mother shoot him a look of pure, undiluted hatred, her arm tight around her daughter's shuddering shoulders. On the other side of the divide, his own relatives and college friends gravitated towards him, their support a mixed and complicated offering. A cousin clapped him on the back, a rough, congratulatory gesture that felt more like an approval of the violence than an understanding of the pain. An old roommate simply nodded, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and awe, as if Alex had performed a dangerous, reckless magic trick. But not all the attention was supportive. An aunt, her face pinched with sanctimonious disapproval, marched up to him, her finger wagging. She hissed words about Christian forgiveness and the sin of pride, her voice trembling with a righteousness that ignored the foundational sin of betrayal. She called his actions cruel, monstrous, a permanent stain on the family name that was far worse than any discreet affair. He absorbed her words without reaction, watching her mouth move, seeing not a defender of morality, but another weapon in the arsenal of the day. Grief, weaponized and turned back upon him as condemnation. This was the new landscape. It was no longer about the affair itself, but about his response to it. His calculated exposure had become the new transgression, a social crime that some found unforgivable. He received a firm handshake from his stoic grandfather, a silent communication of masculine understanding, followed moments later by the averted eyes and cold shoulder from the wife of his father's business partner, her judgment a silent verdict on his lack of decorum. He was both vindicated hero and vengeful villain, his character now a Rorschach test upon which every guest projected their own definitions of justice, loyalty, and cruelty. He stood amidst the shattering of friendships and the fracturing of family, a cold king surveying a kingdom he had chosen to burn, receiving a confusing medley of crowns and curses, all while the weaponized grief of the day continued its relentless, fragmenting work. The initial explosive chaos had settled into a low, simmering dread, a quiet aftermath where the consequences began to unfurl like poisonous flowers. The grand hall was nearly empty now, save for a few stragglers and the hotel staff who moved with a hushed, embarrassed efficiency, clearing away the detritus of the aborted celebration. The vibrant floral arrangement seemed to wilt in sympathy, their colors dulled under the harsh, unforgiving lights that had been switched on full. Alex stood near the bar, a half-empty glass of whiskey in his hand that he had no intention of drinking. It was a prop, something to anchor him to the physical world as the digital one began to bleed into his reality. Mark found him there. He approached not with the bluster of the confrontation, but with the shuffling gait of a defeated man. His tuxedo was disheveled, his bow tie hanging loose, his eyes red-rimmed and pleading. The scent of stale alcohol and desperation clung to him. He stopped a few feet from Alex, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. He began to speak, his voice a ragged whisper, the words tumbling out in a messy, incoherent heap. It was an apology, but not for the betrayal itself. It was an apology for getting caught, for the mess, for the public spectacle. He called it a mistake, a stupid, drunken lapse that had spiraled out of control. He pleaded for understanding, for a return to the brotherhood they had once shared, his words circling around the edges of the truth, but never landing on its brutal, intentional core. He was trying to minimize the asteroid impact into a mere stumble. Alex listened, his face an impassive mask, his silence a more profound condemnation than any shouted insult. He saw not remorse in Mark's eyes, but a frantic, self-serving panic, the terror of a man watching his entire world evaporate. The apology was just another form of deception, and Alex felt nothing but a cold, hollow contempt for the performance. Before Mark could finish his pathetic appeal, a new presence intruded. Chloe, her makeup a ruined watercolor of blacks and reds down her cheeks, her magnificent gown looking like a shroud. She detached herself from her mother's protective grasp and walked towards him, her movements fragile as if she were made of glass. She did not look at Mark. Her entire world had narrowed to the man she had wronged. Where Mark's plea had been frantic, hers was a tearful confession, wrenched from a place of genuine, soul-crushing shame. The words were barely audible, choked by sobs. She admitted to it all, the loneliness, the insecurity, the thrill of the secret that had curdled into a constant, gnawing fear. She didn't blame him or his work. She laid the fault squarely on her own weakness, on a hollow place inside her that she had tried to fill with Mark's attention. She confessed to the specific lies, the fabricated spa weekends, the fake smiles over romantic dinners, the profound, corrosive guilt that had tainted every moment of their engagement. She was baring her soul, offering up her own eviscerated heart as the only thing she had left to give. She begged for his forgiveness, not for reconciliation, but for the simple, desperate hope that he might not hate her forever. Alex watched her, the coldness inside him a shield against the raw vulnerability she displayed. He saw the truth in her breakdown, the genuine agony, and yet it failed to penetrate the glacial fortress his heart had become. Her confession, while real, changed nothing. It was merely the final emotional audit of a bankruptcy he had already declared. As her sobs subsided into ragged breaths, his phone, which had been buzzing intermittently in his pocket, began to vibrate with a new, persistent urgency. He pulled it out. The screen was a flood of notifications, text messages, missed calls, and, most ominously, a torrent of social media alerts. He tapped the screen, and the digital fallout began to scroll before his eyes. A guest had already posted a grainy, vertical video of the moment the vows were interrupted, the gasps of the crowd tinny through the phone's speaker. The caption was a single incendiary word: scandal. His name and Chloe's were already trending locally. Hashtags he had never imagined. Wedding revenge, public humiliation, bloomed like toxic fungi. Strangers and distant acquaintances had become instant moral arbiters, their comments a stark divide of savage approval and vicious condemnation. King, read one. He's a monster, read another. He saw his own face, a cold, determined still from the ceremony, juxtaposed with a paparazzi-style photo of a weeping Chloe being hustled to a car. The story was no longer his. It belonged to the world now, a piece of public entertainment to be consumed, debated, and discarded. He looked from the digital firestorm on his screen to the human wreckage standing before him in the ruined hall, and for the first time, a sliver of doubt, cold and sharp, pierced his armor. He had wanted them to feel the cost of their betrayal. Now, staring at the escalating consequences, he was forced to reflect on the terrifying, incalculable price of his revenge. The last of the guests had fled, leaving behind a cavernous silence that was somehow louder than the chaos that had preceded it. The grand ballroom was a ghost ship, adrift on a sea of spilled champagne and trampled flower petals. Alex stood amidst the wreckage, the cold, clean scent of the night air cutting through the lingering sweetness of decay. He had sent his parents home, their worried faces a final, blurred image in the periphery of his focus. The staff had been dismissed with a generous, silent tip, their pitying glances sliding off him like rain. Now, there was only the echo of his own footsteps on the polished floor as he moved with a predator's patience towards the small private anteroom where he knew she would be waiting. He found her there as expected. The room was meant for joyful pre-ceremony gatherings, its walls adorned with cheerful art, a plush velvet settee positioned beneath a soft golden light. Chloe was a stark, broken contrast to the room's intended purpose. She had shed the heavy train of her wedding gown, the intricate bodice now looking like a torturous cage. She sat curled in on herself on the edge of the settee, her arms wrapped tightly around her middle, as if holding her very self together. She had been crying, but the tears had stopped, leaving her face a pale, ravaged landscape. When he entered, she flinched, her eyes lifting to meet his, wide with a fear that was as tangible as the furniture between them. He did not speak at first. He simply closed the door, the soft click of the latch a definitive sound in the quiet room. He walked to the window, looking out at the city lights twinkling indifferently in the distance. He gave her his profile, a clean, unyielding line. He was giving her space to feel the full weight of his presence, of the judgment that filled the room as palpably as the air. Why, Chloe? His voice was quiet, devoid of the theatrical fire from the reception, but it carried a chilling, absolute authority. It was not a question born of curiosity, but a demand for an excavation. He was not asking for the story of the affair. He had already laid that bare for the world. He was demanding the reason for the crack in her soul, the flaw that had allowed the poison in. She drew a shuddering breath, her fingers twisting in the fabric of her ruined dress. For a long moment she said nothing, the silence a battleground between her shame and his will. Then, the words began to spill out, halting and raw. She did not speak of Mark. Not really. She spoke of the long, quiet evenings alone. She spoke of the feeling of being an accessory in his ambitious, driven life, a beautiful piece to be displayed, but not truly seen. She confessed to a deep, gnawing insecurity that his success only magnified, a fear that she was not enough, would never be enough for a man who seemed to have the world at his feet. Mark's attention, she whispered, had been a drug, a quick, easy fix for the emptiness. It had been flattering, exhilarating, a way to feel desired and powerful in a life where she often felt invisible. It was never about love, she insisted, her voice breaking. It was about the desperate, pathetic need to quiet the voice inside her that whispered she was unworthy. Her confession was a complete and total surrender. She laid her psyche bare, every weakness, every fear, every moment of petty jealousy and profound loneliness. She offered no excuses, only reasons, and in doing so, she handed him the ultimate power, not just over her present but over the narrative of their entire past. He could now rewrite every memory, every moment of tenderness, through the lens of her confessed inadequacy. When she finished, she was hollowed out, a shell of a person slumped on the velvet cushions. Then came the plea. It was not for a second chance. The public evisceration had burned that bridge to ashes. It was for forgiveness. A simple, desperate hope that somewhere in the future, the man she had once loved would not remember her only with hatred. She used his name, a soft, broken sound, her eyes begging for a flicker of the warmth she had once known. Alex turned from the window finally, his gaze meeting hers. The city lights were at his back, casting his face in shadow, making his expression unreadable. He absorbed her plea, her raw vulnerability, the absolute power he held in that moment to grant a shred of mercy. He felt the weight of it, the intoxicating control, and he let it sit there, a heavy stone in the silence, before he made his choice. He did not raise his voice, he did not show anger. He simply shook his head, a slow final movement. "No," he said, the single word as clean and sharp as a guillotine's blade. There was no malice in it, which was the cruelest part. There was only a profound, unbridgeable distance. Her regret, however genuine, was her burden to carry. His power in that moment was the power to withhold absolution, to let the consequences of her actions settle upon her shoulders in perpetuity. He had forced her to admit her deepest insecurities, and in doing so he had confirmed them. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving her alone in the gilded silence with the echoing, unforgiving truth of his refusal, a monument to the ultimate cost of betrayal and the cold, relentless engine of regret. The silence in his apartment was a physical presence, thick and suffocating, broken only by the intermittent buzz of his phone skittering across the polished concrete of the kitchen island. For 3 days, Alex had existed in this self-imposed exile, the world outside his floor-to-ceiling windows a blur of indifferent motion. The messages were a relentless tide, a digital echo of the wedding hall's chaos. Some were swords of vindication, praising his strength, calling him a king who had taken back his crown in a blaze of glorious truth. Others were daggers of condemnation, labeling him a monster, a sociopath who had wielded humiliation as a weapon far more cruel than the betrayal that prompted it. He read them all with the same detached expression, each notification a brick in the wall he was building between himself and the life he had incinerated. On the 4th morning, driven by a compulsion he could not name, he found himself standing outside the Grand Hotel. The marquee, which had once proudly displayed their names, was blank. Life and commerce had moved on. He slipped through a side entrance, his footsteps silent on the plush carpet of a deserted corridor. The ballroom doors were locked, but a service entrance near the kitchens yielded to a gentle push. He stepped inside. The vast space was hollow, stripped of its finery. Chairs were stacked high on tables, their legs pointing at the ceiling like the skeletons of strange insects. The air was stale, smelling of industrial cleaner and vacuumed dust. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, illuminating floating motes in the empty space where a dance floor had been. He walked to the center of the room, to the exact spot where he had stood to deliver his toast. The silence here was absolute, a stark contrast to the roaring condemnation and weeping that had filled it days before. His eyes traced the path Chloe had taken down the aisle, now just a stretch of bare, patterned carpet. He looked to the spot where Mark had stood, shifting nervously during the vows. In the crushing quiet, the cold certainty that had fueled him began to thaw, leaving behind a muddy field of doubt. Had it been justice? A necessary surgical strike against a profound wrong, a rebalancing of scales in the most public forum possible? The image of Chloe's face crumbling under the weight of her own exposed secrets flashed in his mind. He remembered the sheer, unadulterated shock on the faces of his friends and family, the way the day had curdled from celebration into a kind of collective trauma. Was that justice, or was it simply cruelty, dressed in the armor of righteousness? He had wanted them to feel the depth of his pain, to understand the absolute wreckage they had created in private by experiencing a fraction of it in public. But staring at the empty space where their lives had shattered, he wondered if he had merely created a different, wider kind of wreckage. He had not just punished them, he had dragged everyone who loved them through the same fire, forcing them to choose sides, to witness a brutality that would stain their memories forever. His revenge had been absolute, but its cost was a phantom limb he could now feel aching, a loss not just of a fiancé and a friend, but of his own place in the intricate, delicate web of community they had all shared. He stood alone in the hollowed-out shell of his perfect day, the architect of its destruction, and for the first time, he truly pondered the terrifying, ambiguous line between being the hero of his own story and the villain of everyone else's. The decision to move forward was not a triumphant surge of will, but a quiet, grim acceptance, like a soldier surveying a scorched battlefield and deciding simply to walk. The hollowed-out days in his silent apartment had become a prison of his own making, the relentless digital judgment from his phone a constant buzzing reminder of the world he had shattered. He could not live in the ruins. The choice was a stark one: be consumed by the ashes of his old life, or begin the slow, arduous task of sifting through them for something that could be used to build anew. He chose the latter, not with hope, but with a cold, pragmatic determination. The first step was the physical evidence. The apartment still held ghosts in every corner: a framed photo on the bookshelf from a hiking trip, a silly mug she had bought him as a joke, the lingering phantom scent of her perfume on a forgotten scarf. But the most potent relics were the wedding photos. The professional album, a heavy, leather-bound tome of lies, had arrived by courier, a final, mocking delivery. He placed it, unopened, on the coffee table, where it sat like an unexploded bomb. For 2 days he circled it. He would pick it up, feel the weight of its polished cover, and set it down again, his stomach a tight knot. He knew what was inside: a curated narrative of bliss. The first look, her radiant smile as she came down the aisle, the exchanged rings, the posed family shots where everyone's joy was a carefully constructed facade. To look at them was to risk being pulled back into the vortex of that day, to feel the phantom pains of a life that had never truly existed. Finally, on the third evening, he carried the album out to the building's rooftop terrace. The city sprawled below him, a vast, twinkling entity indifferent to his personal cataclysm. A metal trash bin stood in a corner, used for cigarette butts and discarded party decorations. He opened the album. The first page was a portrait of the two of them, foreheads touching, their eyes locked in a gaze of what he had once believed was eternal devotion. The image was a masterclass in deception, a beautiful lie captured in high-resolution gloss. He did not page through it. He did not torture himself with the details. He simply took his lighter, a solid silver thing he'd carried for years, and flicked the flame to life. He held it to the corner of the first page. The glossy paper resisted for a moment, then caught, the fire eating hungrily into the image, blackening their smiling faces, curling the edges into brittle, glowing ash. He dropped the burning page into the bin and tore out the next and the next, feeding the flames with the visual record of his own naivete. As he worked, the internal conflict raged, a silent war between the cold satisfaction of justice and the creeping tendrils of something darker. The fire felt good. It was a purification, a destruction of the false idols he had worshipped. Each curling photograph was a piece of the past being actively, willfully annihilated. This was justice, the deliberate erasure of a poisoned narrative, a reclaiming of his own story from the hands of those who had betrayed it. But as the flames grew higher, casting flickering demonic shadows on the surrounding concrete, another feeling emerged. This was not just destruction. It was vengeance. It was the desire to see every last trace of her, of them, of that day, reduced to nothing. The heat on his face was not just from the fire, but from the white-hot core of his anger, an anger that had not dissipated, but had merely been banked, waiting for fuel. He was not just a man moving on. He was a man attempting to burn the memory of his pain out of his own soul, a violent, symbolic act that walked a razor's edge between catharsis and self-immolation. He watched the last of the album's spine blacken and crumble, the flames dying down to embers that glowed like malevolent eyes in the dark. The air smelled of acrid smoke and endings. He felt empty, scraped clean. The justice had been in the public exposure, the calculated reveal. But this private, primal burning was something else entirely. It was the final, furious act of a man trying to kill a ghost, unsure if in the process he was setting fire to the last, best parts of himself. He stood over the smoldering bin, the city's indifferent light stretching out to the horizon, a man alone with the ashes of his past and the terrifying, uncertain freedom of a future built upon them. Weeks had bled into a monotonous gray, the sharp edges of the scandal sanded down by the relentless grind of time. Alex's new life was a study in quiet minimalism, an existence pared back to its essentials, in an apartment that held no memories, no ghosts. He had a new job in a different part of the city, colleagues who knew him only as a quiet, competent man with an unreadable past. He went through the motions with a mechanical efficiency, his days a seamless procession of work, solitary meals and long, aimless walks through the city's anonymous streets. The furious fire that had driven him had burned down to embers, leaving behind a fine, pervasive ash of numbness. One evening he found himself standing before the full-length mirror in his sterile bedroom. The man who looked back was a stranger, his features familiar, yet fundamentally altered. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper, carved not by laughter but by the cold pressure of the mask he had worn for so long. His gaze, once open and trusting, now held a flat observational quality, as if he were perpetually assessing the world for its next potential betrayal. He searched that reflection for a trace of the person he had been on the morning of the discovery, the man capable of blind devotion, of giddy, uncomplicated joy. He found nothing but a hollowed-out shell. His mind drifted back, not to the confrontation or the fallout, but to the moment of the reveal itself. The gasps of the crowd, a symphony of shattered illusions. The way the color had drained from Chloe's face, leaving her a pale monument to her own shame. The utter collapse of Mark's confident posture. In that moment he had felt a surge of something potent and pure, a sensation he had labeled justice. It was the feeling of a balance being restored, of truth, no matter how ugly, triumphing over a beautiful lie. He had been the instrument of that truth, the scalpel that cut out the cancer of their deception. He had given them the consequence they had so carefully avoided, and in the eyes of many, that was a righteous, even heroic, act. But the reflection told another story. As he stared into his own eyes, the memory of justice began to curdle, its sharp clarity blurring into something murkier, something darker. The cold, meticulous planning, the relish with which he had watched their worlds crumble, the absolute lack of mercy in his heart when Chloe had begged for forgiveness. Was that the hallmark of a man serving justice? Or was it the signature of something far more primitive? Vengeance. It was an ancient, bloody thirst, one that demanded not balance but pain in equal measure. It was not about restoring order, but about inflicting a wound as deep as the one he had received. His public spectacle had not been a courtroom, it had been a coliseum, and he had been both gladiator and emperor, thumbs down, savoring the slaughter. The two concepts, justice and vengeance, swirled in the silence of the room, indistinguishable twins locked in a perpetual dance. Had he lost his humanity in the pursuit of what was right? Had the act of punishing their betrayal required him to sacrifice his own capacity for empathy, for compassion, for that essential spark that connects one person to another? The man in the mirror offered no answers, only the silent, unsettling echo of the question itself. He was a man standing at a crossroads in his own soul. The path behind him scorched earth, the path ahead shrouded in mist. The central theme of his life now reduced to a single, unanswerable debate reflected in his own haunted eyes. The reader was left to ponder the evidence, to weigh the scales, and to decide for themselves whether the man staring back from the glass was a hero of his own story, or a cautionary tale of what can be lost when pain is given a microphone and a plan.